Hi, my name is Sean McIntosh. I'm with Method 180. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for this webinar on what you don't know about Microsoft SQL Server can cost you. Lines will be muted during the webcast, and questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. If you have any questions, please submit them via the chat console, and we'll endeavor to answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and available for encore viewing at the method180.com website. Our speaker today is Mike Austin. Mike leads the service delivery team at Method 180 and has successfully negotiated over $1 billion in Microsoft contracts over his career. He spent almost a decade working at Microsoft in licensing-related roles and has extensive experience with best practices regarding licensing Microsoft SQL Server. With that, I'll turn things over to Mike to get the presentation started.
Thank you, Sean. Good afternoon, everybody. I think as Sean mentioned, if you have any questions throughout the presentation this afternoon, please feel free to put those in the chat box, and I'll try and get to questions as I can at the end. I'm going to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions and answers, and if I don't get to your question, I'll try and contact you directly after the webinar to answer your questions. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on our background, but Method 180 is a small boutique consulting firm that helps organizations with Microsoft-related licensing issues. So we have really two main focuses in the business. One is around negotiating Microsoft enterprise agreements, and the second is really around assisting organizations through audits or SAM engagements. And I'm not really going to go into those in depth today. I thought what we would do this afternoon is really talk about SQL Server licensing and how it is confusing. It is a product that is growing in terms of use and in terms of the amount of dollars that organizations spend on it. Most enterprise organizations, which I think most companies that are on the call today have been in these enterprise agreements or these select agreements with Microsoft for numbers of years. And it used to be, if you go back 6, 7, 8 years ago, that 60, 70% of the spend was on the desktop side, in Office and the CALs and the desktop OS. But we've seen a tremendous switch over the last few years where the revenue associated with the servers or the additional products are growing to be equal to that desktop spend, and in some cases are actually outpacing them. So it's becoming more and more important to ensure that you understand how that licensing works and also get control of some of the spend, because as Microsoft launches new products, and we're going to go into this a little bit later today, they're doing things that dramatically can increase your cost and also make it a lot more complicated to stay compliant. So we'll be talking about that in a little bit. So I'm going to go into what I call SQL Licensing 201. So I'm going to try and, I'm basically going to assume today that we have a little bit of a foundation of what licensing is, although I will go into some of the 101 stuff, but I am going to focus on some of the more complex licensing scenarios with SQL. And then we're going to wrap up before we get into some Q&A around a case study of how this all comes together. I recently finished work with a client, and they had thought that they signed a great deal with Microsoft that saved them about $450,000 over 3 years, only to find out that they actually owed $1.2 million in true-ups. And I'm going to go into how that happened and why that's important. And so with that as a kind of backdrop, the reason that everything becomes complex with Microsoft, so one of the things that I hear about in most of my conversations with clients is Microsoft licensing is complex. And are they going to make it any simpler, or why is it so complex? And it really boils down to a lot of things. Microsoft, will tell you that their contracts are an umbrella structure. I kind of look at them as building blocks. But the reason that things get complex is you have a number of different agreements with them that have, enrollments or different types of enrollments. You get into, changes with them that are done in amendments, and then you have everything that's outlined in what used to be called the product use rights or the product list and the product terms. And so if you look at the way that these things work, you sign a master business services agreement with them that kind of overarches anything that you do with them. And I used to like to joke that that's kind of, how you sue them and how you sue them. There's a lot, or how they sue you, sorry. There's a lot of T's and C's in there around indemnifications and things like that. But one of the important things that resides in the MBSA is their audit rights, and so that's an important thing that rides in there. And then underneath that, you get into their programs. So, a lot of people are on enterprise agreements. That sits under that MBSA, or, a Select or their newer program, the MPSA agreement. And those are programs. And so what I always say about those are the language of how a program works, what you can and can't do in the program, how you count things, particularly within an enterprise agreement. And then underneath those, you get enrollment. And those enrollments really are the products that you're buying. So what am I buying in that enterprise agreement? What am I buying under Select? And some of the enrollments actually have very specific terms and conditions. I'm going to talk a little bit later about the server and cloud enrollment that rides underneath an enterprise agreement that a lot of organizations are on or are considering, but there are some special terms and conditions that go into that server and cloud enrollment or the SCE program that aren't in your standard EA. And then underneath that, if you've done anything customized with Microsoft, you're going to have amendments that override language that could be in the enrollment, in the agreement, or in the MBSA. And all of that sits on top of the foundation for Microsoft, and that is what they now term the product terms. And so if you're not familiar with the term product terms, these used to be the two documents, the product use rights and the product list, that about 5 or 6 months ago Microsoft combined into one document called the product terms. And that's really what you can and can't do with the product and the specifics to how you count in that. And so how does this get complex? I'll give you an example, particularly to SQL and how it becomes complex. So if you want to go out and buy SQL Enterprise Server, you have to buy that via the core base metric. So the product terms, or the old product use rights, would tell you how you count cores. So what makes a core, if you are virtualized, how you count cores in a virtual fashion. We're going to get into this in a couple of minutes, but it's going to tell you how you count. And then on top of that is the program that you buy from. So if you're just buying from a Select agreement, then you basically need to ensure that you follow the product terms around how you count cores. The same would work in a standard EA enrollment. But if I had an SCE agreement, the SCE agreement is going to override some stuff. And what I mean by that is it's basically going to say that all of my licenses need to be included in the SCE for SQL. And so where the product terms will say you either need or do not need software assurance, the SCE will override that and force you to buy software assurance on everything. And so how all this all stacks up becomes very complicated. And sometimes when you're looking at how do I license, you may have to look in these various documents and try and piece together how they all work together in order to figure out what your rights are and what aren't your rights. And again, I'm going to come to this in a little bit, but also when you sign things and when you purchase licenses could have an impact. So it's not just about the product terms or the product use rights that are applicable today. They could be the product terms or the product use rights that were applicable 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago, depending on the licenses that you have, okay? And so I'm going to get into a little bit around SQL Server and how we license it, and then we're going to come and go into that specific case study and show how all this all works together. So really with SQL, there's really 3 licensing models, although only 2 of them are available in market today. There was what you call the server cal licensing model. There was the processor licensing model that they got rid of in 2012, and that changed to a core-based licensing model. So what's in market today is a core-based licensing and server cal model with some exceptions. We'll talk about that here in a second as well. And so I'm going to just kind of keep this simple. If I am licensing SQL Server in a server cal model, I purchase a server license for SQL that's standard now. I can't buy enterprise that way anymore, but if I buy a server license to apply to the server, and then I buy these client access licenses to allow either users or devices to access the server. And so this is kind of some of the basics, but where we really get into some of the more complex licensing terminology with this is around things like a license reassignment rule, or you may have heard of it called as the 90-day rule. So in other words, if a license gets assigned to a server for today and it's in a virtualized manner, or I retire that server, I can transfer the license, but it's now tied to a new server for 90 days. I can't reassign it. The other thing to note is that SQL Enterprise is no longer available in this model. And so if I have a brand new SQL Enterprise server that I'm bringing on, I have to purchase that in a core-based model. And we've seen that cause some challenges with customers where they had all their users or devices covered under CALs. They could have bought a $10,000 or $12,000 SQL Enterprise server license. Microsoft retires that model. They need a new enterprise server, an 8-core box, and it's going to cost them $160,000. So, there was some definitely impact, 4 or 5 years ago, or 3 or 4 years ago, when Microsoft made the change in 2012 to core-based licenses and dropped SQL Enterprise as being an option to be licensed under the server CAL model. Now, it is important to note that if you had active software assurance on SQL Server Enterprise Edition, so the server CAL model, that you can continue to renew that. They have not said that they're going to eliminate that option, but if you did, you now also could have potentially SQL Server 2014 that you can use in a server CAL model with Enterprise, even though you can't buy that model anymore. And so sometimes, depending on what you're doing, that can become a benefit to you, because if you've got a server with lots of cores, there is a restriction on that. Here comes the gotcha in a second. But if you've got a server with lots of cores and you have enough CALs, you may be better to shift the server license to that server and purchase core licenses for a server that's got smaller number of cores. So maybe I got a box that has 12 cores, and I could maybe shift that license from a server that's only got 4 and move it over there as long as I have enough CALs. They do put a restriction on here that the server is limited to 20 cores, and this is where, if you go into the product use rights, that's outlined. And it actually says that the SQL database has to be able to utilize 20 cores, more than 20 cores. So in a virtualization model where you have a host server with greater than 20 cores, you may be able to still use these. You have to really dig into that, but that is a potential that you can still use this, okay? And so that's an important thing to note, that is, if you have some of these old enterprise servers that are covered under SA that are now SQL 2014, you can shuffle those to your higher core boxes as long as you don't break the 20 core limit on that license, to decrease the number of cores that you need for other servers, assuming that you have enough server CAL, or enough CALs to cover your use in that scenario. Okay, and so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but there really are 2 CAL types. There's a device CAL and there's a user CAL. I usually boil this down simply to the following: if I'm licensing device-based, Method 180 would have to buy probably about 4 CALs for myself, because I have my laptop, I have my smartphone, I have my tablet, and I actually have another laptop. So they would buy 4 CALs if we were licensing myself in a device-based model. If they're licensing users, MyCat Method 180 only needs 1 CAL, and then I can access from any device. And this goes whether it's SQL or Windows, Exchange, SharePoint, anything that's licensed in the server CAL model. And so you really look at this and say, okay, do I have more devices? Do I have more users? Which one's the most cost-effective? And what are my usage scenarios? But it is important to note, I did run into a client, believe it or not, a little while ago, where they had processor and core-based licenses where you don't need CALs, but they also had CALs for every single one of their users. So they had enough processors and cores to cover their environment, and they were maintaining software assurance on 100% of their users for CALs, and that was just basically money that didn't need to be spent. So, like I said, prior to 2012, they had a per processor licensing model, and I bring this up because people still have historic licenses where they can use in a processor model. And one of the things that we look at quite often when we do these engagements is we really do look at what entitlements you have, how best to apply those, how can you drive cost out leveraging those things. So you may still be sitting on some entitlements that you can use. The other thing that we do see is in the out there in the world today, deployments really are very few SQL 2012 and 2014 servers are in the deployment data that I see. In fact, I think it's probably about 15% or so or less if I was to guess. Most of the server base out there is 2008, 8 R2, and 2005 with still some 2000 out there as well. So SQL doesn't get upgraded all that often. So these licenses that you have in the old per processor model could be valuable so that you don't have to buy cores. But in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about how they could be even more valuable in how you look at architecting SQL to drive out cost as well as how you license it. So I think that's, really the one thing that I wanted to talk about on the processor model. There were really two ways that you could have done it. You could have licensed processors based on the physical host and the number of actual sockets, so to speak, that are in the host, or you could have looked at virtual processors inside processor licenses to your virtual use if you were in a virtual environment. In 2012, they switched that metric from per processor to per core. And basically what they did in that case was they said that one processor would be equivalent to 4 cores. From pricing, a lot of you would have been through their transitions where if you had processors with 8 cores, they would have given you grants. And, they told you it was great that they gave you a grant, but they actually doubled your cost because now you're paying for 8 cores, which is twice the price of a single processor. So this was a well-disguised price increase by Microsoft because the average server from the data that I've seen is about 6 cores on average. So, they probably got a bump of about 50% of the revenue across the board on SQL Server when they made that change. One of the things to note with cores is that you can license, again, the physical cores in the box, or if you're virtualized, you can license the virtual cores. We'll talk a bit about hyper-threading here in a second. But there's another concept that, one of the things that Microsoft does have is a core factor, where if you do have certain AMD chips, they put a 0.75 core factor on. So basically, if it's a 12-core box, you only need to license 8. So there are some things there to keep in mind. And we find a lot of people actually don't take advantage of the AMD core factors when they are using those AMD chips. So the other licensing model that they have is what I'll call pre-production or test and development. And so what happens a lot of the time is you can buy these licenses or licenses for your pre-production environments in one of two ways. And so I can buy SQL Server Developer Edition, which I think the last time I looked at that, it was about $50 per user. So it's a very cheap way to put SQL into the development environment. Now, although it's called SQL Developer, it is the feature set of SQL Enterprise, but it just deploys a SQL Developer, but you do get all those enterprise features. So this is a very cost-effective way to license your test and dev environment versus purchasing kind of full production licenses for that environment. The other way that you can get test and dev is if you have MSDN subscriptions or active MSDN subscriptions, include the rights to use SQL Server and other Microsoft servers for that fact in a test and dev environment without licensing them. Now, one of the things that I will say that we've seen recently, Microsoft is ramping up audit activity. I think all software companies really are. But, they're evolving their audit process. 6-7 months ago, when they came in and said, we're auditing you, you gave them a list and said, here's all my test servers and all my developers have MSDN licenses. They typically just accepted that. Now we're actually seeing them log into those servers to check the user logs to see who's had access to them. And so, it's not a problem because UAT testing is allowed, but we've seen them try and make claims of, secretaries or receptionists or cashiers in a retailer require these MSDN licenses because they logged into a pre-production server. And so you kind of want to just make sure you're documenting that stuff. You can easily get rid of those, but you want to make sure that that's documented. It's just something to note there, okay? But, I will say that most organizations we see today are licensing their test and dev environments either through developer licenses or through MSDN, although there's still probably 20 to 30% of the organizations that we work with that aren't taking advantage of this low-cost way to license your pre-production environments. I'm going to take a quick commercial break here, kind of tongue-in-cheek. I just was speaking about audits. I did write a white paper on on dealing with Microsoft or just software vendors in general around audits. If you want a free copy of that, you can just go to method180.com/audit-book, and if you drop in your email and contact information, we'll send you over a copy of that. And the other thing, just to note, Microsoft launched or announced in the last week or so that Windows Server is moving to a core-based licensing model, with the release of Windows 2016. We've done some early analysis, and since 2012, basically, we believe Microsoft has increased the price of Windows Server by 43%, including this most recent announcement. And we're going to do a webinar in January to talk through how that is and what you can do to avoid those price increases. So if we go back and step back for a second and just kind of look at all those licensing models, a lot of the times what I get asked from clients, and this is one of the areas that they get caught on, is where should I use which licensing model? When should I use processor or core? When should I use server cal? Where should I use dev? What should I use in the dev and test environment? And so I just put this quick chart together to kind of show you the biggest gotchas that are out there in terms of where and when you can use the licenses. So really the processor and core-based model can be used across all of these scenarios, so whether that's your corporate use, whether that's for external access by employees, so I don't know, Salesforce, where your salespeople go home and log into your applications that are running on SQL. You can use processor core licenses, and that works there. The processor core model works when you're using SQL as a database for your internet sites. It also works very well in a scenario where you've got suppliers or customers or partners that are accessing your databases, because you don't have to count users in these cases. And you can use it in a test and dev environment, although I question if that's the most cost-effective way, but you definitely could use it there. The server cal model also works in all of those scenarios, with the exception of the internet sites, because usually those are anonymous users that you can't count, or so not knowing who you're assigning a server cal to doesn't work. But I do get asked quite often about suppliers or customers or partners, can I use my server cal licenses to allow my partners, for instance, to access an application that's sitting on SQL? And the answer is yes. If it's a population that you know and you can name them, you can purchase cals for those users and allow them access to it. The real question becomes, how many of them are there, and is it cost effective, or is it more cost effective to go to the core licenses where you don't have to count users and have unlimited users there? And again, you can use those licenses in a test and dev environment. Again, the question is that cost effective? But I did see one client that didn't want to purchase MSDN, and what they did was they used a bunch of their old SQL Enterprise Server cal licenses to cover the pre-production, because they knew they only had 40 or 50 IT staff that accessed those servers, so they could use those server licenses, add 40 or 50 cals, and they didn't even have to worry about MSDN because they weren't using the Visual Studio tool. So there are all kinds of creative ways that you can utilize these licenses. And then obviously, your dev licenses, SQL Developer Edition or MSDN, can only be used in test and dev and UAT. Those aren't available to be used to cover production use. So I want to talk about this license reassignment rule and why this becomes important. And this is really, as people are virtualizing or have virtualized more and more, really where this boils down to is, when I'm in a virtual environment and I have a technology like vMotion or DRS, where a guest server can move from host 1 to host 2, here's what really happens. And so I got a guest, it's on host 1, it moves to host 2. Microsoft says that the license can move with it, but now it's assigned to host 2 for 90 days. And so if vMotion sends it back over to host 1 a couple hours later, I can't send the license with it because it's tied on this temporary license reassignment rule to host 2. And so that's the concept. It's basically you can transfer licenses. You can't do it on a temporary basis. It has to be assigned for 90 days. So in these virtual environments and these highly dynamic environments, you're basically going to get yourself in trouble if you're trying to assign licenses to an individual VM when you're licensing them. Now, for SQL Server, what Microsoft did, and I'll talk about whether this was nice of them or not a little bit later, but they say if you have software assurance on your SQL servers, we'll override the 90-day rule. So if we go back to our example of a guest that's on host 1 moves to host 2 without SA, it's stuck on host 2, the license is stuck on host 2 for 90 days. When it fires back to host 1, I'm out of compliance because I can't send my license with it for 90 days. But if that license has software assurance, when it goes back to host 1, the license can go with it. And so they basically override and allow you to do server mobility with software assurance. And that actually goes, I get asked a lot of the times, Mike, what about if we're using Azure or AWS or some other third-party cloud provider and we want to put our servers up into their cloud? They actually have cloud mobility as well. The concept is exactly the same. You can move that up to AWS, okay? So how do we license SQL Server by the core? In a physical environment, this is pretty straightforward. I basically count the number of sockets or processors, the number of cores per processor, and I have to buy the number of licenses equal to those number of cores. The one kind of complexity here is Microsoft sells all core licenses in 2 packs, so every license is 2 cores, so you just make sure you divide by 2, and that's the number of licenses you need. But that's really the only kind of tidbit there. Now, there are a couple of things where you get some free servers from Microsoft, and I put free in question mark because this is changing. And so, for instance, if I've configured my SQL servers in an active-passive cluster, the passive side is free. Again, I'll put a question mark, come back to that in a second. If I'm using SQL in a DR scenario, it could be free. Again, the question mark is there because it's only a cold DR scenario where basically you can't do any live data replication. You can only bring the server up and transfer data over on a periodic basis. And so we don't see those DR server licenses being that useful. I've actually gather a guess that it's less than 20% of clients that can take advantage of that because most DR scenarios are warm or hot DR, and the license is only for cold. Now, when you get into the virtual server world, your licensing, you can do licensing in one of 2 ways. I can license the virtual cores that are associated with the virtualized SQL database. Again, all SQL Server is, and I think I forgot to mention this in the physical world, they do have a 4-core minimum. So if I've got an older server that's 1 processor, 1 core, I have to buy 4 cores for that. I can't just buy 1 core. I have to buy 4 cores. So with virtual, I can license the virtual cores as long as they have that 4-core minimum. Now, where a lot of people get caught is in hyper-threading. If it's turned on, basically all vCores, all vCPUs, or virtual threads are considered a core in Microsoft language. So with hyper-threading, sometimes this can escalate to growing numbers of cores that need to be licensed. But basically, I license all the vCores, and I can license at the virtual level. Now, if I wanted to, I could actually license as well at the host level with SQL Enterprise, and if I license all cores in the physical box with SQL Enterprise cores and SA, I get unlimited virtualization. And so, that could be a potential. Again, I get asked all the time, Mike, does it make sense to license SQL for unlimited virtualization? The real answer is it depends. It depends on how many SQL instances you can get onto that box. So if I can get more virtual cores on the box than I can physical cores, and their enterprise servers for SQL standard is a lot cheaper, so you probably don't want to do it if it's standard edition. But if I can get more virtual cores onto that box, technically, then it makes sense. Again, it's not something I see a lot of organizations being able to take advantage of because a lot of the times their SQL workloads, they don't want to max out the workload on the server because they need that compute power to run the databases themselves. So again, it's very few people that can take advantage of this enterprise SA to get unlimited virtualization. Again, if I haven't tracked this, but my gut tells me it's about 20% from what I've seen in the practice. Okay, so I know that's that's, you know, a lot to kind of, you know, get in 15 minutes or so, but I think the key message is there are, you know, there's lots of different ways, and this is why it's so complicated. You know, you just think I can go server cal, I can go processor if I had some old licenses, I can license core, I can license my dev environment differently, and now I'm going to throw another level of complexity on top of this. And so there is a difference depending on the product or the program that I purchased through. So I talked about this a couple of, you know, at the beginning, is that, you know, I can buy these licenses through an enterprise agreement or a Select or an MPSA, and basically all entitlements that I have can be used. So in other words, if I got a SQL estate that's 100 servers, as long as I have a license for all 100, it doesn't matter if they have active software assurance or not, with the caveat if I need it for server mobility, I need to have SA on it. But as long as I have entitlements that cover me for my usage, it doesn't matter if I have some that were bought 6 years ago that don't have software assurance on them and some that do. I can mix and match. I can basically buy what I want to buy, and I can choose to purchase that with software assurance or not. In an enterprise agreement, as an additional product, I can just put in the ones that I want to have SA on. So if I have a server that I do not want to have software assurance on for whatever reason, I could buy a license only on Select versus truing that up into my EA. So you can kind of mix and match. A little bit of thought needs to go into how to manage that process, but you definitely can do that. Now, there was a couple of previous programs that Microsoft had called the Application Platform Agreement that evolved into the Enterprise Application Platform Agreement that has now turned into the Server and Cloud Enrollment. So you may have had an APA, you may have had an EAP, you may be on an SCE, but basically what that is another enrollment that slides under an enterprise agreement. It works the same way. I buy all my licenses, I deploy through the year, I true up. But what Microsoft does in this program is they say 100% of your SQL, if I put SQL in, 100% of my SQL licenses need to be included in the SCE, and everything in the SCE has to have software assurance on it. And we're going to see why that costs people money and why this program is not necessarily what Microsoft, you know, bills it to be, nor does it live up to what they tell you will save most of the time. And so, you know, a lot of the times people may be coming off of these scenarios where they had some old licenses, they had SA. Microsoft will come along and say, hey, that's great. We'll grandfather what we call dead licenses or your SQL 2005 processors in. We'll do it at a subscription price instead of making you purchase new licenses and software assurance, and you'll get a better deal. And then they tell you that they're going to give you discounted prices on SQL to do this. And so, yes, on signing, you get 15%. So if I'm buying on an EA, LNSA versus the SCE, LNSA, I save 15%. I save 15% on signing, net new, I save 15% on my true-ups. On renewal, though, that drops to 5%. And so that 5% is not a great deal when it's just software assurance only. And they do throw in a couple of other benefits that they'll try and position with this program from time to time. They'll give you unlimited problem resolution support, which is one of their assay benefits, where if I got a problem with my server, I can, you know, call in and you know, or sorry, I can log onto the web and answer that. But it's important to note that that's not Premier support. They try and position it like it is, but it really isn't. So it doesn't necessarily make your Premier support contract go away, and that's, you know, I get asked that quite a bit. So where am I going with this? And so I always do this presentation where I basically say that if you look at SQL from SQL 2000 to 2014, every edition and every version have different rights, okay? And so what do I mean by that? So if we look at SQL Server 2005, for instance, Standard and Enterprise did not allow you to do license reassignments. Server mobility, not allowed. But Enterprise, if you were licensing with processors, even Server Cal, had unlimited virtualization. So if I have a SQL 2005 processor, and as long as all my SQL databases are 2005 or less, I get unlimited virtualization, okay? And my passive server was free. So that's good to know. In 2008, what changed? Not really all that much. Standard has restriction on license reassignment. Enterprise, though, they gave you for free, by the way, no software assurance required, server mobility. So in other words, if I was licensing at a virtual CPU, my license could move with my guest OS in that scenario that we were talking about when we moved from host 1 to host 2 and then back. My license could move with it for free, and still the passive server was free. So then they launched 2008 R2, and what do? Enterprise has license mobility, Standard doesn't, so that doesn't change. Enterprise now only has 4 VMs. So they'll tell you that this was a great thing, but they took away something. Enterprise used to have unlimited virtualization. Now they've limited it to 4 VMs per license. They introduced a new SQL Data Center license that had unlimited virtualization. And so in deployment data, I don't see a lot of SQL Data Center licenses where we did see the licenses, SQL Data Center deployments. We did see clients that had the licenses to get unlimited virtualization, but very few, I think less than 5% in the data set that I have SQL Data Center 2008 R2 installed. And so they were buying it for the license rights, okay? The other thing that they did when they launched 2008 R2 was they no longer made CALs kind of to the version. So if you had SQL 2008 CALs, but they didn't have active software assurance on them, you couldn't access a 2008 R2 server. So even though they were calling it 2008 R2, it really was like SQL Server 2010. They made it a new edition without calling it that. So then along comes 2012, and Microsoft makes the switch. So we no longer can license on processors. So we lose processors, we move to cores. We know that if I had a server with greater than 4 cores, this was a price increase because I had to buy more core licenses, even though they would grandfather me those, but now I'm paying more in my software assurance going forward. So they went back to enterprise can be unlimited virtualization with an asterisk in that it had to have software insurance on all the cores in order to do that. They put server mobility in there with a new asterisk, software assurance needed to be included. So it used to be free with a license. Now I have to have software assurance to get that. And then they eliminated the ability to purchase SQL Enterprise on the server CAL model, okay? So, you know, those were the big changes. Now, in 2014, they launched 2014, and they take yet another thing away from us. So in the past, up to 2014, my passive servers in an active passive cluster were free. I didn't have to have active software assurance. With 2014, they've come along and said, you need to have active software assurance on that server in order to get the passive server for free. So what does this all net down to? As Microsoft, as organizations realize that the value of software assurance, particularly for SQL, is limited when it comes to the upgrade rights, which is what you purchase software assurance for. So I buy SA so that I can go from 2008 to 2012. As they realized people were not renewing, they started to stuff value into software assurance by taking away free rights and forcing you to pay for SA to continue on that annuity stream, okay? And so, like I said, everything changes from product to product. And so if we go back to that chart that I had up earlier where I was talking about the complexity of program, product use rights, and things like that, if I have a bunch of licenses for 14, 12, 8R2, 8, 05, and I have an estate of licenses, when I bought that license, what that entitlement was means that I could have done different things with it, okay? And so that's going to bring me to my case study. And so this is an actual client that I worked with about 4 or 5 months ago, and they basically wanted me to come in and do a self-assessment for them on an audit. And so we looked at their entire Microsoft real estate, and we found a bunch of stuff where we helped them. But here's one of the things that I had to give them some bad news on. And so really what happened was this client was in the EAP agreement, which was the predecessor to SCE, which worked the same way. All my SQL licenses needed to be included. And so basically what we did for them was we went out and got their deployment data, okay, and we used the tool. Microsoft, if you're doing anything with Microsoft where they want deployment data, they're likely going to tell you to use their MAP tool, the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit. We've done lots of engagements with that. There's some good things about the tool. There's some pitfalls to watch for with the tool, but it does a decent job of going out and collecting inventory. In this case, because they didn't have a tool set for a lot of stuff, we used a tool that we like to use called Block 64 to go out and get the inventory. But basically with MAP and any other tool, we do the same thing. We want to start to take a look at our environment, and this is just a subset. These guys had about 400 SQL servers, so they were a pretty big estate. But what we do is we organize things by host, then by what we call computer name here is the guest, the product, 2008, the edition, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we do is we want to go through and look at this customer, and there's a bunch of interesting things here. And so, one of the things is what we look for is do any of these servers make sense to license at the host level? And so if we look at host 1 here, this is a great example where it's got, 28 cores, vCores, but only 16 physical cores. So we license this one, again, remember the divide by 2 with 8 licenses to give them unlimited virtualization. But when you looked at, host 2, it's only got 1, so the 24 cores on there, we only want to license 2 licenses here. Now, you'll see it's 2 V processors in this case. It's a 4-core minimum, so we had to buy 2 licenses. We couldn't just buy 1 in this instance. And so we went through and looked at each one of those. Now, you'll notice we have some formatting and things in here, and that's for when we're looking at how to optimize your licenses, how we do this. And, that all becomes important, So, for instance, SQL 2012 is on this server, and we want to know that so that we can't apply processor licenses or whatnot. So if you're wondering what the conditional formatting is, it's just when we're optimizing licenses for clients, it's a way for us to quickly look at what's on that server so that we can ascertain what's the best licensing model for that particular use scenario. Now, what I wanted to show here is because they were in an SCE, you'll notice this one here, we're assigning Enterprise 2014 cores. All of these are 2014 licenses. Now, these guys had an estate of licenses. They had a bunch of processor licenses. They had some server cal licenses. They had a bunch of stuff. And so when we took a look at their environment, if they were not in the SCE, and so we wanted to show them whether the SCE was of value to them or not, or the EAP, I guess in this case, was of value to them or not, we actually went out and looked at how do we optimize your licenses. So again, we do the same thing. We look this server here. It's great to license for unlimited virtualization at the core level. But what I really want to point out are a couple of things. And so if you look at this server here, for instance, it's all SQL Server 2008, but they have a couple of SQL Server 2012s. And so we talked to them about, can you move server 22 and 23 off to, host 1 or host 4 where it makes more sense to go to? Because we're going to license this with 12 enterprise cores, but you're sitting on some enterprise 2012 processor licenses, 2008 processor licenses that allowed for unlimited virtualization. So as long as this host doesn't have a server over 2008, those 2 licenses we can use, and that decreases the number of cores that we need to buy overall. And so we do look at, not just what's the best to do, but how do we use all those old use rights. So that's why I brought that up. In this case, licensing this server with 2 processors, if only 2008 were on it, is a much better way to go than licensing for unlimited virtualization using their cores. Now, lots of stuff falls into that. Is vMotion on? Are these things going to fly? Are they clustered? And all kinds of stuff. But I'm kind of simplifying, and that's what you'll see here. I said on host 5, SCI should move those 2012 so that we can use those 2008 processor licenses. So really, what ended up happening in this client? So at the end of the day, they had some shortfalls. They were short some enterprise cores, they were short some standard cores, and they were licensing a bunch of their servers in server cal, and they thought that they didn't have a problem, except for they only had 5,556, to be exact, cals covered under software assurance, and they were much closer to 10,000 users. And so they had some risk even on their server cal model in here. But we couldn't use, and I bring this up, if you look at all of these licenses in here, we couldn't use any of these because they were in that program that said everything needed to be covered under software assurance. And so what did that really mean? these guys had to do a true-up of $1.2 million to be compliant with the program, even though they were 100% compliant with all the licenses that they owned. So let that sink in for a second. They signed an EAP agreement because Microsoft told them it was a great deal. They were going to save $150,000 a year or $450 based on the SCE discount, only to have to do a $1.2 million true-up in order to be compliant with the program. The day the SCE expired, they were compliant because they had all those licenses sitting on the shelf that they could use. And so these guys were in a conundrum. They had to spend $1.2 million to be compliant based on a program. They didn't want the software assurance for lots of reasons. They weren't upgrading their physical environments. They were consolidating and whatnot. So, you know, it was a very tough pill for them to swallow in order to be compliant with the program, okay? And so, Sean, I'll open up the questions now. Just a reminder, if you want a copy of my free audit booklet, just go to the method180.com/audit-book, and I'm happy to send that out to you. So, Sean, I think I did see a couple of questions pop up. Do you want to maybe bring those up, and I'll try and get to as many as we can here in the last couple of minutes?
Yeah, absolutely. We do have a few questions queued up. I'd like to remind folks who haven't asked any questions, if they do have some, please submit them via the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them. So the first question we have is, does Microsoft recognize the HT sharing settings for our guest OS settings in VMware to avoid the thread issues with SQL licensing?
That is a good question, and I've never come across that one before, so I'd have to do a little bit of research. So, Sean, if you want to just know who that is. And
absolutely. So I've got the name of the person who submitted that question, so I will reach out to them following the webinar, and we can coordinate some time, do some research, and get an answer for them.
Yeah, and I believe, if I understand the question, it's like, can we lock it down based on using some technology within VMware? And I just want to make sure that that's correct. I'm just not familiar with that technical term. So
I'm just curious, Mike, can you use technology to lock it down that way to regard things? Or
the typical answer is no. If the Windows OS can see the cores, you have to license them, okay? So if the software itself can limit the number of cores that the database can see, so if the application limits the number of cores that SQL can see, but the Windows OS actually sees those cores, then you have to license the cores. And so it really is unfortunate, but a lot of these technologies that can do these things, the way that they look at it is, if Windows Server can see the cores, they have to be licensed. My guess is that's going to be the case in this scenario. I'm just not quite 100% positive on that technology, so I'd like to do a bit of research.
Perfect. No problem. The gentleman has provided me with his email address, so we'll reach out to him following this, and we can get that answer. The next question I have is, how does Microsoft Map fit into this, and does it report back to Microsoft?
Yeah, so I get asked that all the time. So the Map tool itself, you know, from everything I've done, probably 100 engagements where Map has been used, I don't believe it's reporting back to Microsoft. Okay, I've never heard a client seen that. I've never seen evidence of it. I don't think they're collecting that data, so to speak. So unless you give it to them, they're not getting it. Now, the tool itself basically does a WMI sweep, so it basically sweeps, you input your IP ranges as long as you have the right network credentials. The key as well is to make sure you have the VM credentials so that you can get the mappings of host to guest. So it just does an IP sweep and comes back and gives you your inventory. It does a decent job. There are some artifacts that show up in there that look like they should be licensable and they really aren't, so you want to make sure that you're careful with that. The other thing that I always tell people with MAP is you do not want to hand over raw map data to Microsoft, okay, because as soon as you hand over raw data, they make assumptions. I call it like the grocery list approach. You hand them over something, say I have 200 servers, Microsoft says you need 200 licenses, but that doesn't tell the story. Maybe I'm using MSDN in my test and dev. Maybe we've done some things with our configurations to make sure that we're using the right licenses from a virtualization perspective. They're going to apply SQL 2014 rules to everything, even though we're sitting on some of those nice 2008 where we can get unlimited virtualization or whatnot. So you really want to make sure that you don't hand over raw data, that data is telling the story the way that you want it to be told to Microsoft. You don't want to hide things from them. I don't advocate that, but you don't need to turn over the raw data and let them make assumptions. Okay?
Okay, that's good. And as it stands right now, I have one further question that's queued up, and That is, how does Microsoft define non-production and testing when you're using MSDN related to SQL? I need to have a body of my end users test apps on the SQL Server.
Okay, so there's a couple of questions in there. So the first thing is you are allowed to do user acceptance testing, and UAT testers do not need to have MSDN licenses. That is included in the rights of the MSDN. So, in other words, if I create an application for I don't know, finance, and I want a couple of finance folks to come in and test that, they can come in and test that as a UAT tester, okay? And so really the way that Microsoft defines it is, as long as you're not writing back to production, then it is pre-production. So everything right up to UAT and QA is pre-production, but when you start replicating data out of what you're doing in the test environment into the production environment rather than just a snapshot, when it's more or less live, that's where the switch more or less flips, okay? And so, UAT testers are free. The thing is, if they're going to do an audit and they're going to look at user logs, they will find those people. Just want to be careful of that and make sure that you have that or able to document that they are UAT users. And then, basically everything up to QA and UAT is pre-production. The switch flips when you start, basically replicating the data over on a frequent basis.
Okay, perfect, Mike. Thank you. I think that about wraps it up for questions, but I think your contact information is on the screen right now. If anyone has any further questions that they'd like to ask or would like to reach out to us to understand how we can help their organization in more detail, please feel free to reach out to Mike directly. But I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. We know it's a very busy time of year for everyone. And in the new year, please watch for our Windows Server webinar, in which we're going to go through the new core-based licensing model. And lastly, this presentation has been recorded. We'll be putting it up on the method180.com website. It should be available for viewing by the end of the week. Mike, did you have any parting words before you go?
No, I think that's perfect. If anybody's got any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to try and answer. Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon. Bye.